the nations belong to us. All the world, all the nations, all the nations. Lord, for the sake of the poor, the downtrodden, the needy, the ignorant. At the beginning of 2021, when they began vaccinating people, most of the deaths were people that had been vaccinated. I told you that. And most of the people dying are those that have been vaccinated. And so they invented something else and said there's a new wave. They had tried to pin it on India. India rejected it, and so they quickly gave it another name and called it Delta variant. They have another one now.
This is African Perspectives. As Africa has experienced the tide of fresh winds of economic prosperity, new human settlements, and the promise of increased access to education as promised by BRICS political transition of various forms, elections in some nations or military assisted in some cases, there are, however, renewed calls for lockdowns. The South African High Court has ordered the country's health department to hand copies of all its COVID-19 vaccine procurement contracts, negotiations, and agreements to a non-governmental organization, Health Justice Initiative, HJI. Activists celebrated this landmark win for transparency after court orders COVID vaccine contracts to be made public. The court compels South Africa to review details of its COVID-19 vaccine contracts. The contracts were in the public interest as more than 30 million vaccines have been administered in South Africa with a budget of 10 billion, around 530 million US dollars being allocated to cover this in 2021 alone. So today we ask, are these discussions that are being held as a result of this landmark victory going to be a precedent that is going to be set all across Africa, where we are going to see litigation for these contracts to no longer be a secret, but to be reviewed and to be made public? And I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Herman Edling from the SA Vaccine Injury Medical Legal Study Group. You're welcome, sir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Oscar.
We're also going to have online Dr. Shankara Chetty, who's also going to join us in this discussion. Dr. Herman, how important is this court outcome, this victory that we have seen? How important is it?
It is of major importance, Oscar. For some reason, the government, I'll just use the word government as an overarching term, has been completely unwilling to share documents that are in the public interest with the public or with organizations that represent the public interest in relation to various aspects of COVID, the pandemic, the lockdown, and most importantly of the vaccines. I am aware of a number of organizations and political parties that have requested information that the public is entitled to under PIA, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, and all of those requests have been ignored or turned down. Why the government is unwilling to share important information like that with the public, one can speculate about. But now, for the first time, this organization, Health Justice Initiative, has achieved a breakthrough. It is the first time that an organization has gone so far as to get to a judgment. And this is, to me, a landmark judgment in South Africa, because it is asserting a constitutional right, that the public has a right to access to information. And it's asserting the importance of the PIA Act, that the government cannot keep secrets from its citizens, which is what the government has been doing. So I absolutely applaud the Health Justice Initiative for having had the the strength and the resources and the dedication to go through with this.
The concern, is it mainly because being a matter of public interest, is
Yes.
it mainly about the public funds, or it is more to do with the implications when it comes to what the organization does in terms of investigating and studying the injuries that emanate from vaccination?
These documents will be very important for a number of different issues. It is evident from the judgment and that the Health Justice Initiative obtained that they did not seek any kind of relief from the court in relation to the safety or the effectiveness or the need for vaccines. They didn't challenge that. They didn't challenge anything about the vaccines.
Vaccines, yeah.
They simply challenged the fact that the government entered into secret contracts with international companies at great expense, and where there is good reason to believe that in that the government committed the people of South Africa not only to current resources but also to future resources. And the government has kept that secret from the public. And that is the real injustice which is now being corrected. That the government cannot contract on behalf of the people of South Africa but keep the people in the dark as to what the costs will be. And there are clearly costs. And all the costs have so far and will in the future be carried by the people of South Africa. It will not be the government officials who make these decisions that will pay the costs. It will be, on the one hand, in terms of money, it will be the South African taxpayer who will pay for costs where the taxpayer and the public had no say and not even any knowledge about what was being negotiated and what was being promised. On the other hand, which is outside the scope of this judgment, when it comes to the administration of the vaccines, the safety and the effectiveness of the vaccines, there are many other implications for human health that will affect everybody in the country.
So what is the implication of this in terms of the work that you do? The access perhaps that you're going to get, how is it going to help your cause in terms of defending the injustice that is caused as a result of the injuries that have been incurred for those that have been vaccinated?
Let me just clarify this. I'm not an activist, and the organization that I founded is not an activist organization.
Okay.
We are a study group.
Okay.
So we are an intellectual, scientific study group, and we are interested and have been now since our inception, have been studying the effects of these vaccines on the health of people. And we study vaccine injuries. We've studied the mechanisms by which vaccine injuries occur. We've studied the different kinds of harm that occurs by vaccine injuries. We study how doctors and other health practitioners can help to treat patients who've suffered vaccine injury.
Okay.
And because of our study, our members are also in a position to advise courts if people like claims for compensation for vaccine injuries.
Okay.
So we are able to give evidence in that way.
We're going to go on a short break.
Yeah.
I want us to take a look at these videos, then we will come and discuss further.
I think the court was very alive to the urgency that we were arguing for the disclosure of the contracts, and they certainly upheld our argument that it's in the public interest for this disclosure to take place. And you mentioned that the department is reading the judgment. Well, they have very few days to do so. The court has instructed that within 10 court days, they have to hand over all the documents. So we look forward to receiving that, and we look forward to our government not, delaying this matter any further and actually making that information available. Potential prejudice to the department in future negotiations didn't stand up. It also found that their arguments on confidentiality would not trump the public's right to have access to this information. And you must remember, Kathy, that nobody has alleged that anything illegal has happened. That is not the reason why we want the contract. why we want the contract primarily is to have a sense of the terms and conditions imposed by big pharmaceutical companies who bullied governments in the global south. So we certainly cannot have a situation under national health insurance or in the next pandemic where pharmaceutical companies simply demand secrecy and our government then has to agree to it. And in this particular case is also defending it. So I think that argument doesn't hold any sway, and certainly the court has basically found in our favor in those respects. In addition to, arguing that the pharmaceutical company should have been brought into the case, the court was very clear that the onus in relation to that was actually on the department because, and to use the court's words, we were rebuffed in our many attempts to try and find out even the contracting parties' details. So definitely nothing sinister in the public using South Africa's laws on access to information and our constitutional right to have access to information, particularly where public money has been used, and especially in a context where there's so much duty to uphold the principles of transparency and accountability. We live in a constitutional democracy. And we've said from the very beginning of this case that it's unacceptable for very profitable and very wealthy multinational pharmaceutical companies to come into the country and distort our democracy. And they didn't just do it in South Africa. They've done it everywhere else. And so the net result of that is that they've sullied our entire vaccination program with this much level, of secrecy and confidentiality for no good public interest reason. So we certainly want these contracts to be open. We will do whatever, it takes within our power to make sure that the court judgment is actually respected and that it's upheld. And we're really looking forward to the Department of Health making all of this information. There needs to be transparency and accountability. And you can't measure transparency or accountability if you're dealing with blanket non-disclosure agreements or a total secrecy placed on all of these procurement contracts. Now, we as South Africans paid a lot of money. It's running into billions of rands for these vaccines. The supplies came to us very late or not at all, at a time when we were facing wave after wave after wave of COVID infections and different variants, and we were trying to mitigate that. So I think it's important for the public, and I think the judgment has affirmed that we have a right to know what's in those contracts, and the disclosure is definitely, as the court has said, in the public interest. And, critically, I think part of that is that a company can't come into South Africa, demand secrecy, demand very broad confidentiality clauses, and then use that as the basis not to disclose any part of the contract, or for our government to the last 2 years. We used our access to information laws, we were rejected, our appeals were rejected, and so we had no option but to actually approach the court, and that process takes some time. And I think that's a lesson for us going forward on the national health insurance as well as in the next pandemic, that there simply has to be a better system for proactive disclosure. It can't be civil society trying to take our government to court to order the disclosure of contracts, whether it's on health procurement, whether it's on energy procurement, whether it's on education procurement. I think, your question around why is it significant now, I think it's really essential for 3 reasons. One, we're going into an era of national health insurance where the state will be the sole procurer of most health goods, and they will coordinate that entire process. Secondly, there are global negotiations currently underway that deals with a pandemic treaty for the world in which to find a framework to respond to the next pandemic, which there will be one. And transparency is at the heart of those negotiations and is actually a sticking point in those global negotiations. And I think thirdly, it creates a precedent for government to understand that they have a constitutional duty not to always defend the secrecy demanded by very powerful pharmaceutical companies who will be the main suppliers, and the national precedent can be created that even during a state of disaster, even during a public health emergency, that some of the minimum norms and principles around proactive disclosure have to be observed, that it could become a lesson for pharmaceutical companies at the next time.
Rollers, brand new construction at Target. What is it for? Not 1, not 3, not 5, not even 7, but 24 brand new drive-up terminals in a town of 16,000 people. What would be the need for that? I'll tell you the need for that, because they're bringing it back. They're going to bring back draconian lockdowns. They're going to bring back the torturous mask mandates in schools, strapping your kids up with a medical device and oxygen inhibiting bacteria-ridden Sharia face muzzle. They're going to bring back the injection mandates. They're going to close down churches. They're going to close down small businesses while these people stay open. And the pharmacies expanded too. Why do you think that is?
Welcome back to African Perspective. We're having a discussion here with Dr. Edling with regards to the outcome of the High Court judgment that was made concerning the release of contracts, procurement contracts for COVID-19 vaccine in the nation of South Africa. And two things that Fatima has emphasized that are critical to this judgment in terms of what they want to achieve: the issue of transparency and accountability. Do you think we're going to get the transparency and the accountability when it comes to those that have suffered as a result of the vaccination in terms of the injuries and all that? Are we going to see the government being brought to account with respect to say, you took an experimental vaccine, you did not do the necessary due diligence that was required, and now we've got several people that have got injuries that are emanating from this?
Oscar, in a sense, you're asking me to speculate about the future and to speculate about the government. I cannot read their minds, but what I can tell you is we have known about vaccine injuries from the beginning of 2021, because the vaccines became available in December 2020. And from January, we've known that there were vaccine injuries. We've been talking about it, we've been discussing it, we've been writing about it. I wrote a letter to the President in August 2021, raising serious concerns about vaccines. The President simply ignored it, didn't answer any of my questions, didn't take any of the rational steps that I requested, which would all have been responsible in the interests of the health of South Africans. A month later, I wrote a follow-up letter based on further information that had become available by September 21 to the Minister of Health. Also, that letter was ignored. Various people and organizations have been trying to communicate with SAHPRA, the South African Health Product Regulatory Authority, and the Department of Health in relation to the problems of vaccines. And so far, I'm not aware of any cooperation or information that has come from the side of government. So far, the government has taken an attitude of, we're not going to talk to you, we're not going to disclose anything to you. And in terms of this particular judgment that Fatima Hassan was talking about, they asked for information early in 2021 already. They went through all the PIA processes. By February 2022, because of non-cooperation, they then went to court. And this case has been in court since February 22. In other words, 18 months before finally a court order orders the Minister of Health and the Information Officer of the Department of Health to disclose the information. So that is not, in my experience, the behavior of a government that wants to be transparent and open and promote the health interests of the people of South Africa. I don't understand why the government does not want to be transparent, but so far it has not been transparent. And also, if you look at the arguments that were led in court on behalf of the Minister of Health in this case, they tried very hard to get the court to say, no, they don't have to disclose the information. So they very clearly and very badly do not want to make that information available. Now, when a government is so serious about protecting secrecy, one has to wonder why.
Is it not because of the non-disclosure agreements that they've signed with the big pharmaceutical companies, which could perhaps jeopardize their prospects of future procurement with those organizations?
That was one of the arguments that were argued in court on behalf of the government, of the Minister of Health, and the judge dealt with that and found that that was without merit.
Okay. I want to hear from Dr. Chetty. Good evening, Dr. Chetty. Kindly unmute your microphone.
Nice to see you again.
Thank you so much for joining us in this discussion tonight. What does the judgment mean for the medical fraternity and also for the sub-Saharan Africa when it comes to a precedence being set on which different organizations can actually take the government to court to say some of the things that you do not want to disclose are of public interest, and as such, as a government, you have a responsibility to make public such documents, such contracts that you have made, because they've got an implication on the public funds.
I think it was a very important judgment. The public have been censored for long enough and we've not been given a voice. I think it's vitally important that this judgment bends towards the government that should be for the people, by the people. And we have a right to access to this information. I think in view of all the controversy that surrounded the pandemic and the procurement and distribution of vaccines, from a scientific and from a regulatory perspective, I think it's vitally important that the information comes out into the public arena so that those people involved in the pandemic can actually see what truly has gone on and clear up all those discrepancies, conspiracy theories, the anti-scientific narrative once and for all. And to do this, I think we need the facts of what transpired. A lot of the intervention by government was scientifically nonsensical. A lot of censorship went on with good professionals sounding alarms. And I think it's important to understand why government took the route that it took. And it did not do this alone. This was done globally. And of course, the contracts with non-disclosure agreements with pharmaceutical companies was done globally as well. So we'd like to see how these contracts and of course the confidentiality agreements actually advised governments' response to the pandemic, because we saw a lot of governments around the world do exactly the same thing. Was this part of the contract signed with the pharmaceutical industries to toe that line? So I think a lot of this needs to be clarified, and this is the first step in giving the public a voice and the right to inquire into government's actions.
Do you think we're going to see the pharmaceutical companies being brought to account once this information is disclosed, it's out there in the public? Will the pharmaceutical companies be brought to account is the same way we are bringing to account our government?
I think that they should be. They should be held responsible, liable for any injuries. But of course, we know the pharmaceutical companies that they will do everything they can to avoid that kind of litigation. But the vaccine injuries are unquestionable. The safety or lack of safety and efficacy of the vaccine is unquestionable. And in view of that and the science behind the vaccines, I think that the pharmaceutical companies grossly misrepresented the effects of the vaccines to both the regulators and to government. Looking at their initial trials, there was absolutely no evidence of safety or efficacy. And that is considered fraudulent, and it makes any contract with the government or regulators null and void. And I think that needs to be brought up. So the pharmaceutical companies will do everything they can to sidestep the issues, evade the truths, but I think we must do everything in our power to hold them accountable for what's transpired.
Dr. Edling, you've been at the fore in terms of your study. What are some of the things that you have encountered, the discoveries that you have made in doing this investigation on the impact of the vaccine on the human body?
Oscar, first of all, and Dr. Chetty, who I know very well, also knows a lot about this. He can tell you stuff maybe that I can't tell you. But basically, this thing should never have been called a vaccine because it isn't the same as any other vaccine. It's a completely new technology based on mRNA, but it's not even virus mRNA. It is synthetic mRNA that's almost like the virus. It is introduced into the body in a thing called a lipid nanoparticle.
Okay.
It bypasses the skin and the nasal mucosa, which are the first lines of defense against any infection, and it goes directly into the cells. The lipid nanoparticles deliver it without any resistance into the human cell. In the cell, this mRNA programs the human cell to produce a viral spike protein. That spike protein is the pathological, harmful part of the coronavirus. The COVID-19 virus, the part that is pathogenic is the spike protein. So this vaccine makes your body manufacture the dangerous part of the virus. Then that does elicit an immune response. But when the immune response comes, it finds that spike protein attached to the cell that produced it. It thinks that that is a virus cell. So your immune system destroys your own cell because there's a spike protein on it.
Okay.
And that is the basis of autoimmunity, where your immune system attacks your own body.
Okay.
So that is the first kind of problem. Now, many conditions have been determined that people get injury by the mechanism of autoimmune injury. So myocarditis, that is very well known, Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a neurological paralysis, miscarriages, diabetes, many conditions, skin conditions occur because the body's immune system attacks your own body. That's an autoimmune disease. And that can happen in any organ in the body. So there are many diseases that people can get by the mechanism of autoimmunity. Another major cause of problems, the mRNA itself, when it is free, stimulates blood clotting.
Okay.
And also the spike protein stimulates blood clotting. And it is very well known that with all of the vaccines, some of them more than others, but all of the COVID vaccines, there's a major problem with blood clotting abnormalities. And blood clotting abnormalities cause blood to clot in the vessels where it shouldn't clot. And that gives rise to conditions such as a heart attack, or a stroke, or a pulmonary embolus, or a deep vein thrombosis, where you get blood clots developing where you shouldn't have blood clots. Another place, if you get microclots, they just clog up the little blood vessels in any tissue. So, for example, in the lung, if the small blood vessels in the lung are blocked by little blood clots, you don't get adequate flow of blood through the alveoli of the lung, and therefore the blood doesn't take up oxygen. That is why people become hypoxic. They struggle to get enough oxygen into their body because of micro blood clotting in the circulation of the lungs. So many of the diseases or injuries that people get are according to the mechanism of abnormal blood clotting. And then the third major type of condition is because this vaccine is such a huge onslaught on the immune system. It's not like a flu injection or a polio drop that can be dealt with easily, because it spreads through the whole body, and there's so many of these spike proteins that get produced. The immune system in many people is overwhelmed because it is such a big onslaught.
Okay.
And that exhausts the immune system, to put it simply. So then your immunity against other things goes down.
Yeah.
And that affects cancer, because to prevent yourself from getting cancer or to deal with an emerging cancer, it's your immune system that must look after that. To prevent you from getting herpes or other viral infections, bacterial infections, it's your immune system that protects you. So this whole class of problems is on the basis of immune suppression. So the COVID vaccine overwhelms your immune system, and now you are susceptible to all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
And if you look at all the hundreds and hundreds of specific conditions that have been reported as vaccine injuries, you'll find that they all fit into one of those three major classes. And of course, every one of them can affect every organ of the body. So it's like a systemic pathogen It's been injected into the body, it affects the whole body, and any part of the body can become sick.
Ever since you started delving into this study
Yes.
of the COVID-19 vaccine,
Yes.
what have you since learned about all the other traditional vaccines?
Well, that is a very important question, and also an embarrassing question. Because, I mean, I was vaccinated, my children were vaccinated. When I was a GP, all my patients were vaccinated. My whole life I've believed in vaccination. I realized there was a problem with COVID vaccination because it was so different and because there were so many harms. But in the course of these studies, I now have learned more about traditional vaccines. And some of the things that I've discovered, and this, when I say I mean us, many of us.
Many of you.
Many of us have discovered that this thing of indemnity to vaccine producers has been a thing since 1980, of the 1980s, where the vaccine manufacturers essentially held the United States government over a barrel and said, you've got to give us indemnity or we'll stop making vaccines. President Reagan gave them that indemnity. From that moment, they didn't have to bother about safety because they were immune. If their vaccines caused injury, they couldn't be held liable. And because of that, they didn't have to spend so much money on safety, research, development, etc. And a virtual explosion of vaccines occurred as a result of that, because it became a very profitable market with very low costs. And you know that in the United States now, people get in their lifetime 75 vaccines that are recommended or mandated or whatever by the CDC. Now, we've always believed those vaccines to be safe. But one of the important things to understand about them is that every vaccine has a thing called an adjuvant. It's something to make it more irritant so that it will stimulate a more powerful immune response. Those adjuvants have been heavy metals like mercury and lead and other things. Sometimes they will use another vaccine as the adjuvant in a new vaccine. Now, if you get 75 vaccines, you get such a big dose, which is cumulative, of these metals or other adjuvants, that they cause problems. So it's not the vaccine necessarily itself, but it can be the adjuvant that accumulates. And if you look at disease patterns in the United States, at the same time that this indemnity was given, from then going forwards, the rate of vaccination went up, and with it the rate went up of childhood allergies, of asthma, of diabetes, of autism, of other neurological developmental disorders. So many disorders in American children and adults have increased dramatically since the bigger rollout of vaccines. Now, there have not been the proper studies that should have been done to determine whether the vaccines were the direct cause of those conditions. Because the mere fact that something happens at the same time as something else doesn't prove that there's a causal relationship. And of course, for medical science and for public health, it's very important to know what is causing things. So there may be other causes, but the public health authorities should have taken note of those escalations and performed studies to determine the cause. Now, one wonders also why they didn't do that. And in the absence of proper studies to determine the cause, one has to keep a healthy concern about the possibility that traditional vaccinations have been responsible for the escalation of allergic conditions, neurologic developmental disorders, etc., obesity, metabolic disorder in the United States.
I want to hear from Dr. Shankara Chetty. You had the discussion that I was just having now with Dr. Edling, in terms of the efficacy of the vaccines, even the traditional vaccines, to say, as they're doing this study that was zeroing in on the COVID-19 vaccine, they began to also look at the traditional vaccines, and they saw that this thing of indemnifying the manufacturers of the vaccines is a thing that has been going on for years. And some of the injuries that we have seen, the disease that we've seen over the years could actually be attributed perhaps to some of these vaccinations, these immunizations that were not really effective or did not actually deliver on what it is that they were designed for. What's your take on that?
I think the indemnifying of the vaccine manufacturers was a huge mistake. We're dealing with a commercial entity that's supplying us with a medical product. And of course, the safety of that product should always be ensured before its efficacy. We cannot dispense something that has a certain purpose, but has a high risk of causing other problems. So risk and benefit should have been weighed. And seeing that this is a commercial interest, negating any responsibility towards safety is what's led to the explosion of vaccinations in the US. Now, when you, like Dr. Edling, the COVID vaccine has opened my eyes to a lot of other things happening with the traditional vaccines. Now, vaccines remain in your body lifelong. They trigger a lifelong immune response. Now, with that triggering of a lifelong immune response, you will have side effects that take a very long time to develop. And so in monitoring these side effects, you need to be vigilant of them over a prolonged period. You can't do it just for a month or two and say, well, the vaccine's safe. They might have implications 10 or 15 years down the line. And that's the reason traditional vaccines have been monitored for extended lengths of period to make sure that they are absolutely safe. Now, with the amnesty granted to these vaccine manufacturers, they don't have to do that. Now, with the COVID vaccine, a lot of what Dr. Edling spoke about, the mechanisms behind the injuries caused by the coronavirus vaccine, were not highlighted by the manufacturers itself. In Pfizer's own clinical trials, they found 1,223 odd different side effects, but they never took the time to understand why those side effects were actually occurring, the mechanisms behind those side effects, so that they could advise us appropriately on who it would be inappropriate to give these vaccines to. And that would be something that I'd consider to be part of what the manufacturers should be responsible for doing. After all, it's their product. We have been having a rough time trying to get information on exactly what is contained in the vaccine. Now, the vaccine manufacturer has all this information and could easily have done the trials and understood the different ingredients, their efficacies and toxicities, and then look at target populations that are not at risk of side effects. Yet, with these vaccines, we weren't told the ingredients, and it was blanket mandated across the population. So a lot of the side effects that we've seen and the understanding around those side effects have come from private individuals, doctors and medical fraternity, taking the initiative to understand what has happened. And I don't think that was our responsibility in the first place. This has now morphed into looking at the traditional vaccines and seeing that they've been with us for a long time. We have populations where they've been used or not used for many years, and we can compare. And like Dr. Edling alluded to, when looking at traditional vaccines, we are seeing that in unvaccinated populations, they do not suffer certain illnesses, where in the vaccinated populations, they are of a certain significant magnitude, like allergic conditions, like developmental defects, like neurologic conditions, autism, ADHD. All these conditions seem to be related to the vaccine, but we can't have a causal link. If we do see these kinds of trends, I think in the interest of public health authorities should pause and reflect on this kind of information. After all, they're in charge of the health of the general public, and they're in charge of the health of a broad population. This is not a one-on-one advice given to a patient by a doctor. They're in control of the entirety of the population, and so need to look at every little signal very closely.
Is this, talking about the medical and the doctors' fraternity, is this a growing sentiment or a growing enlightenment that people are now saying, maybe what we had believed in the past is not so, and now there is a growing need to question some of these vaccines and some of these motives of these big pharmaceutical companies in terms of the products that they are giving for us to administer to our patients?
Yes, for sure, there is a growing concern and an understanding of what is transpiring. It is vitally important to reflect. I'm expected to give my patient the best information, and of course, first do no harm. So an understanding is there, and there is a questioning from the general medical community more and more about the safety of these products. But I think that as critical thinkers, we should be inquisitive about such things. And questions should have been asked from the start. Unfortunately, we have regulators setting protocols which doctors are expected to follow, and if not, come under fire from regulatory authorities. So I think the independence of a doctor advising his patient is under attack, and we should be allowed to ask these questions in an open forum and get honest, open answers to them. And of course, if we have concerns, then future research and understanding should be directed at clearing up those concerns, not censoring those concerns. And with what's transpired with COVID, I think it's opened a lot of health professionals' eyes to the fact that we are working in a very narrow paradigm and need to broaden our scope. A lot of the alternative nutraceutical medications, the alternative therapies have been sidelined. And COVID has been, in a way, a blessing in that it's opened the eyes of the medical fraternity to the diversity of health interventions out there. And so there is this growing trend away from allopathic intervention. Allopathy has its place in emergency medicine, in acute illness, because it provides us the quickest recoveries and the most tangible evidence of recovery. But when you look at long-term chronic illnesses and in the treatment of debilitating illnesses like cancer, I think allopathy is far superseded by natural interventions and other holistic means of treating those illnesses. So I think the pharmaceutical companies, with their monopoly on healthcare, have grossly manipulated the way we deal with chronic illnesses and all these other long-term disabilities. And I think that needs to be questioned, and that needs to come to an end. We need an open discourse amongst the medical and research fraternity, and it all should be directed towards the well-being of the patient and not the well-being of commercial interests.
Okay, looking at the WHO, the World Health Organization, they have now said we need to be better prepared for the coming pandemics. And they are proposing the International Pandemic Treaty. What's your take on that treaty?
I think it goes in exactly the opposite direction of where healthcare truly should be. I think the biggest issue with healthcare is that we don't see people as unique individuals and deal with people on a case-by-case basis. So we have protocols that seem to be blanket instituted across people, and it doesn't take the little nuances of individuality into consideration. Now, the right way to practice healthcare would be to allow more personalized care, with doctors being given the latitude to advise their patients individually. Now, with the pandemic treaty, the World Health Organization seeks to have dominion over all interventions dealing with healthcare, which is a step in the wrong direction. We treat everyone the same when no two people are actually the same. Yes, it also challenges our sovereignty as countries to make our own decisions. It also challenges the doctor-patient relationship, and I think it should be opposed in any and every form that it is proposed.
I'll come back to you, Dr. Edling. What's your take on the pandemic treaty?
I fully agree with Dr. Chetty. Dr. Chetty made a very important point about every patient is individual, and the doctor must decide, in the terms of the circumstances and the uniqueness of the patient, what is best for that person. But just to illustrate that point with a very simple example, do you know that in the trials of these COVID-19 vaccines, they were released after only 2 months of testing? Do you know that? And in those 2 months, in that trial, they excluded very important groups of people from the trial participants. Particularly, pregnant women were excluded. Also, people who had previously had COVID were excluded. People with autoimmune disease were excluded. And people with multiple comorbidities were excluded. So, when the trial data became available, they had zero knowledge of the safety or effectiveness of vaccines in those excluded populations. Yet, and you will know, the moment that those vaccines were made available, the health authorities said everybody must get them. And when they were asked, must pregnant women get them? Yes. Must people with comorbidities get them? Yes. People with autoimmune disorders? Yes. So they mandated, recommended the use of vaccines in specific groups of people who had not been tested. That's just a very gross indication of that. And it is also known from the spectrum of vaccine injuries that every person is not equally susceptible to vaccine injury.
Okay.
So your state of health, your inherent metabolism, your immune system is going to determine how vulnerable you are to vaccine injuries. And some bureaucrat, politician, technocrat sitting in the World Health Organization cannot know if Oscar must get a vaccine or not. They cannot possibly know that. So that kind of totalitarian control, it's like appointing the WHO to be the king of the world, to decide what everybody in the world must do about health. It is very serious.
So looking at this particular judgment, you see, where the government actually has to be forced to hand over those documents, which naturally, for the sake of transparency and accountability, they should be readily available for access by different organizations that want to look at it. And we have got the national health insurance on the cards. What do you think would happen if the government is to take charge of the provision of healthcare services in this nation if they cannot really divulge important information such as this?
Oscar, you didn't ask me to come here tonight to talk about national health insurance. I am very much opposed to the planned national health insurance. I think all that I should say is this: the whole act, the whole planning, everything about it has revolved about the money that will be used in, which effectively means some official appointed by the Minister of Health will have control of all of the health funds of the country. That's what the NHI is. If the government wants to do something to improve the delivery of health services to the citizens of the country, they should work on service delivery. So, doctor training, nurse training, ethical practice, provision of cheap and effective medications. There's nothing of that in the planning for the national health insurance. There are serious problems with healthcare in South Africa. Those problems should be addressed. But instead of addressing and improving or fixing those problems, the government is intent on creating a huge fund under somebody's control. That's not going to fix anything about provision of health. And in fact, if the government, through the way that they seem to want to do it, is going to control private practitioners, then it is like a socialist system, where there's no private practice, where everybody works for the government. And that doesn't work, Oscar. The socialist experiment in the Soviet Republic failed.
Yeah,
The NHS in the United Kingdom is
it's
failing.
failing. Yeah.
So it will fail.
Dr. Chetty, what's your take on the NHI looking at this particular judgment to say this is perhaps just a precursor of what is to come?
I agree completely with Dr. Edling. I think that healthcare, I think this is something that pervades all avenues of politics. We've got bureaucrats with no experience in the fields that they govern, making the rules and regulations. So we've got people who've never taught, telling us how to educate our children. We've got people that have never treated, telling us how we should treat people or patients. And I think it's important that the medical fraternity itself, that are on the cold face of treating patients, should have a bigger say in where healthcare goes. We are very clearly aware of where the budgetary constraints are and where more money should be spent. And I think that doctors or medical professionals should be given a bigger voice in the direction healthcare should take. Now, with the NHI, it opens itself up to gross governmental mismanagement. And I don't say that lightly. From what has happened with the other governmental institutions, I can clearly draw inference that this is a non-starter. It's going to end up with more problems than it has currently. And we've seen this kind of system failing around the world. So I think we need a discussion with health professionals around the table, looking at all the problems we truly face in dealing with patients and the huge health issues that face our nation. And I think we're best suited to give advice as to how these problems should be solved. I think we need a movement where the voice of the people, be it the educated population or the general population, is being heard by government, and government operates within those parameters. We need government to understand what the population requires of them. After all, it's a government for the people, by the people, and operate within those constraints. Now, with the government itself bringing out NHI, there's been a lot of opposition to this bill, but they seem to be disregarding those intellectual voices with valid, absolutely valid questions about its effectiveness in the future. But we got politicians who have absolutely no understanding of the healthcare needs of the population, making the decisions and pushing this bill forward. So yeah, it's a difficult thing to try and get everyone around the table to discuss this. Those voices that seem to be in contrast to what the narrative is are necessarily silenced and sidelined so that the government can give the opinion and the view that a majority of people seem to be for it. So I think we need some open discussion about it. The NHI is definitely not the way healthcare should be going in South Africa. South Africans should have a choice of the kind of healthcare they seek.
Looking at how the National Department of Health is really jealously guarding these documents and these contracts such that they are not released to those that really want to have access to them, do you think they're just going to give them on a silver platter, or they're going to put in a strong fight and perhaps delay it until after the elections for them to release those documents?
Well, I think there's a bigger agenda at play. Look, from my perspective, as a treating COVID doctor, I knew that the vaccines were wholly unnecessary before they were even rolled out. We had safe, effective treatments that were working very well. We did everything in our power to highlight these treatments to government, to the relevant regulatory authorities, to the FDA and CDC, which are the global regulatory bodies, and the World Health Organization, and we were all censored. It was strange to a majority of doctors that safe and effective treatment was being sidelined when we were dealing with the pandemic. But clearly, it was because of protecting the emergency use authorization of a vaccine. And of course, we were sidelined because we We were taught not to be able to prove that our treatments were safe and effective. Yet you give an emergency use authorization to a vaccine where there's no proof of its safety and efficacy. So clearly we can see there was some nefarious things going on. Now, a lot of the governments in the world played along to this tune. We know that there's a different agenda out there, and I think that government will protect itself in every which way it can. The government's main aim is not to serve its citizens, but to ensure its future power and governance. So yes, I think that the government will do everything it can to deflect, to prolong, and to ensure that these documents, if possible, are never made public. And if they are, it will only be made public after the next election, where we cannot contest anything because they've got another term in power. So I think it's vitally important that we detach such things and ensure that this doesn't impact on our choices of elected officials going forward. Whoever's in charge right now should timeously open these contracts and be open to scrutiny from the general public and those health professionals that have questions.
But is it still only a South African issue, this particular case, looking at that it could have implications outside of the South African borders? Because if you look at the percentage of contracts that have actually been opened when it comes to vaccine contracts, it's only globally, according to the Transparency International, only 10% of the contracts have been opened. Because of these far-reaching implications, are we not going to see a stronger fight that is obviously backed by the big pharma, the governments that do not want these contracts to be disclosed, because the same can be happening in different countries once they see the success of South Africa?
I think South Africa is going to be a test bed for what's coming in the future. But I think that we need solidarity. We need people to rise. And I think what this pandemic has shown is that it can take a few global players to coerce, corrupt, and control the entire planet. But we are many, and they are few. And I think we need to find ways of giving people a collective voice and make governments accountable. And if that occurs in South Africa doesn't take its freedom for granted like a lot of Western countries that have enjoyed democracy for a prolonged period of time. And unfortunately, it's pain that makes people rise. And so South Africa's felt the pain, and we're willing to rise, and we're one of the first countries to actually do this. So I think, yes, South Africa stands as a role model for the rest of the world, but this is something that globally needs to be addressed, that there isn't transparency. The sovereignty of individuals and countries is being challenged, and I think it would be amiss for any government official to give away the sovereignty of his country in signing a World Health Organization pandemic treaty that gives an unelected body the power to govern us or to dictate the way we handle future health interventions. So yes, we feel the pain in South Africa. Let's not wait till we've completely lost our sovereignty to attempt to stand and fight. So I think the education of the public is paramount, and programs like this are vitally important in educating the public on what's to come. There is usually a soft change that nobody sees coming until it's too late.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chetty, for such incisive perspective tonight. Dr. Edling, your final remarks?
Well, first of all, it was a very welcome surprise to be able to be on the show with Dr. Chetty. I've got a lot of respect for Shankara.
Wow.
I like him.
Amazing, amazing.
And I agree with everything he said. So I enjoyed speaking to you. And I also agree with him that it's very important where our mainstream media is controlled and where medical advice is censored and controlled, that programs such as yours should spread truth to people.
Yes. Yes, we are all about spreading truth. Do join us same time next week as we spread the truth on African Perspective. God bless you.
At the beginning of 2021, when they began vaccinating people, most of the deaths were people that had been vaccinated. I told you that. And most of the people dying are those that have been vaccinated. And so they invented something else and said there's a new wave. They had tried to pin it on India. India rejected it, and so they quickly gave it another name and called it Delta variant. They have another one now.
Rollers, brand new construction at Target. What is it for? Not 1, not 3, not 5, not even 7, but 24 brand new drive-up terminals in a town of 16,000 people. What would be the need for that? I'll tell you the need for that, because they're bringing it back. They're going to bring back draconian lockdowns. They're going to bring back the torturous mask mandates in schools, strapping your kids up with a medical device and oxygen inhibiting bacteria-ridden Sharia face muzzle. They're going to bring back the injection mandates. They're going to close down churches. They're going to close down small businesses while these people stay open.